Hello and welcome back to The Movies Made Us Do It. Me and Matt are back. How are you, Matt?
I'm pretty good, sir. How are you?
I am very well, very well. I was just going to say to you, but it was getting too near the end of the opening intro. You run into danger territory where you're like, I need to unmute and talk in a second. Because for some fucking reason, despite this not ever going out live, we always record this show live. Like, we record it and never edit it, or very rarely, unless, like, someone rings the doorbell or something, you know?
Yeah, or we've made such an amazing...
Or we've completely fucked it, yeah, which does happen. But it goes back to the old radio days, you know? We used to do this show live, and it's like, we just do it live. No, I was going to say, but I may as well say now, the Time Machine review...
Yes.
Thank you for all of the views, and also all of the likes. That's got, like, about 30-odd likes now, that
really?
episode. Yeah, which is really nice. Like, that's just, it's nice.
Oh.
Because usually all we get is people bitching that they didn't find the full movie when they were trying to watch it.
Yeah.
And if that's the reason you've come to this episode, I'm sorry. Disappoint.
Well, I'm not sorry, really, because we clearly
it's
a podcast and it's not the actual movie.
We're relatively clear about that. It doesn't say full movie in the title. I like the ones when it says full movie, but you can see that the running time is like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
You're like, Anyway... Today, I'm curious, actually, where this one ranks for you. Today, we are covering The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes from 1970. Billy Wilder directing, and starring Robert Stevens, Christopher Lee, Colin Blakely, and more. I'm curious... both where this ranks on Sherlock Holmes movies for you, and also where this Sherlock Holmes ranks for you.
So this is one of those anomaly ones, I think.
Yeah.
Because...
It feels like an anomaly when you're watching it.
Yeah.
To be honest.
I think this is one of the best Sherlock Holmes movies.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's right up there with Hammer's Hound for me.
Yeah, see, I prefer Hound.
Yeah.
But this is very good. And I think Christopher Lee's Mycroft is probably my favourite part of this movie.
Oh, he's wonderful.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
He's so surly and pompous, and I love it. It's great. It's one of the first times where I saw a sort of such a different Holmes. Because I was used to, Rathbone. Rathbone was my first, and
Rathbone is a very difficult one to follow.
Yeah, Rathbone was always my first, and then then Peter Cushing, and then Jeremy Brett, which in my opinion, Jeremy Brett is the best.
Because originally, weren't they going to have Peter O'Toole in this one?
Yes,
I think that was the original plan.
Yeah, so there was a number of sort of people bandied about. Rex Harrison wanted it, but he didn't. The director. Wilder didn't want him.
Right.
And there was a number of... I think it was going to be O'Toole and... what's his name?
Peter Sellers.
Peter Sellers, thank you. Yeah, Peter Sellers was going to be the Watson.
Mm. Now,
the other one that was banded around was Nicol Williamson, who ended up playing him in 7% Solution later.
Oh, okay.
Which, weirdly, I'm not keen on Nicol Williamson's portrayal of Holmes, but that is a good movie, The 7% Solution.
So I totally agree. I prefer Cushing because that's just my jam. But I think Robert Stevens is great as Sherlock. I fucking really enjoy Colin Blakely as Watson.
Well, see,
there's some really funny bits with him that
he's closer to the sort of the Nigel Bruce Watson, isn't he? He's a lot more of not a buffoon, but he's a bit more bumbly, a bit more sort of...
He's the butt of the jokes, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with Stevens, with Stevens' portrayal of Holmes, it's so sort of camp and at times bitter.
Yes, I think it needed it.
And sarky. He's very sarky, which Holmes can be, but not. It's like they've taken all sort of the little digs that Holmes would give, and turned them up.
Sure.
it made them slightly more over the top, and there's a sort of melancholy about his Holmes that I really love, and I think there's no getting away from it. This is probably one of the few times where you could agree with some people who there's a lot of people that want to make Holmes gay.
Sure.
Because of his relationship with Watson, because there aren't many real sort of associations with women in the stories.
Yeah.
A lot of people that want to make
and just their relationship in general is very close.
I think this is one of the few times where you can genuinely go, yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, there is a scene where he pretty much is outright asked and doesn't answer, in such a way, and we'll get to it, but it very heavily implies that he is gay.
Mm-hmm. And I think Wilder himself wanted to go further, but I think he said he chickened out, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's 1970. It would have been pretty controversial to go much further at the time, I would imagine. Not that I was around in 1970, but my impression of it would be that would probably be difficult for 1970.
Yeah, so as a portrayal of Holmes, he's
I love his portrayal.
My favourite, but it's
unique,
right up there. It's a really good Holmes and Watson, and again, it's whether you with the Watson, it's whether you can tolerate the Nigel Bruce.
Yeah,
my wife hates Nigel Bruce.
Oh, really?
Which kind of hurts me, because she hates the sort of bumbly old man Watson, and I like the bumbly old man. I like the very avuncular Nigel Bruce. He's wonderful. He has some of the best little funny moments in those films, which, to be honest, if said by someone else, wouldn't have been as funny and wouldn't have worked. So, I mean, he was my first Watson, so I think that's why I love him so much.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you go read the books, you're like, okay, well, that's not really Watson, is it? But it's things stick with you when and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And as we said, Blakely definitely is in the slightly leans closer to him than I don't know, some of the off the top of my head I can't Hardwick or something, what's the other guy that was in Brett ones? I can't remember the other guy that played him in the Brett ones. But it's all relative, and I think that's one of the good things about Sherlock. There are so many, performances, and I think
varying performances, which I quite like. They've all got their own little spin.
Mm-hmm. I think we've discussed this many times, and even when we did
Hound
Baskervilles, but even some of the American ones, I liked the Elementary.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, I liked Elementary more than I liked Sherlock. So,
season 3 of Sherlock is a fucking disaster.
Diabolical, isn't it? That whole series, that first season is so good.
Oh, it starts off great. Season 2 is already starting to show signs of going off the rails, but season 1 is superb.
And similar with the Moriarty things.
Yeah.
There are many interpretations of Moriarty. I hate Sherlock's Moriarty. I think he's just so silly and over the top. And it's like the Joker.
Yeah, it kind of,
Moriarty Joker, and I hate it. It's so, and I think the actor, I forget his bloody name now. Yeah, I think he's a good actor. I just think he's bloody terrible in that. But yes, we're rambling.
We are. Let's get on with it.
Yeah.
And we open at the bank, a bit like almost a cold open, at the Cox & Co. Bank. And we're taken into one of the vaults, and we get the voiceover from Watson, we see that basically there's a safety deposit box effectively, which has been sealed, and it basically contains mementos of his time with Holmes.
Yeah, and Watson basically says that there were cases that were so sensational that. They didn't.
This case in particular is cracktastic. So yeah.
Yeah, and he says, that it wasn't to be open until 50 years.
Yes.
Later.
Yeah. And one thing I do love is the as we get the opening credits, I do like the mementos coming out. I like all of that.
There are two things that don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
One, why is it full of dust?
Well, yes, I know. They're like old.
It looks like it was fucking buried in Egypt, for fuck's sake.
I know.
Like open buried in Egypt.
I know. I know. This movie, it really is cracktastic when you look at it. It brings a whole new meaning to the fucking term midget submarine.
Yes. Yeah. And you got the 221B nameplate, the house plate.
Yeah.
Which when you go to the house in like a couple of minutes' time, is green and looks nothing like that.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah. Yeah. But yeah.
Stupid little things.
Yeah. But it's a nice open. I quite like the idea of it.
Yeah.
I mean, not a whole lot more. Don't they also take like fucking like some coke out of the fucking thing as well?
Yeah, there's a gun, there's the needle, there's some handcuffs.
Like, here's his heroin.
It's all sort of it's weirdly done, to be honest, because you just sort of think if it was supposed to be mementos that were locked away,
or
it would probably just be papers, to be honest.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? That's the weird thing, because it is almost like he's saying this was locked away because it was too sensational or too scandalous or top secret.
Yeah.
But also I've put a load of mementos in there for no reason.
Yeah.
Like his hat's not top secret or scandalous.
Yeah, random stuff that everybody just needs to sort of, I guess it's just to show them.
Yeah, it's nice. I like it, but when you think about it.
Yeah.
But anyway, we then cut to 1887 and they've just solved this previous murder. So they're coming home to Baker Street, and as you said, the
way he broke the case was it by measuring how far the parsley had melted into the butter on a summer's day.
Yeah. But yeah, so they've just solved a case, and they're basically they get home and they're immediately chastised by Mrs. Hudson, who's like, if you'd let me know you were coming back, I would have made you some food, and
Yeah, I cooked you a goose.
Yeah. But yeah.
Irene Handel, I love Irene Handel. She was in a lot of sort of these old movies, and she was like almost always played sort of slightly doddery old bat, characters.
Yeah,
and she's great as Mrs. Hudson here.
I love the Watson's quite proud of himself as he kind of shows the paper, and he's like, look what I've written. And I love Holmes's immediate response is like, oh yeah, I guess we'll learn all kinds of things. And he's like, what do you mean by that? And he's like, well, come on.
What I did, sort of thing, isn't it? Yeah. And I love the way he says it's all,
he's like, you always embellish things. He says, like, you say I'm like 6'5" and I'm really only 6'1", and
you've saddled me with this ridiculous costume that I now cannot be seen in public without.
He blames the illustrator for that, though, doesn't he?
Yes, he says that's Padgett. That's nothing to do with me. And he says, was it he says, something about elaborating and embellishing. They're talking about women. He says, you've made me a hopeless misogynist. He says, and I don't dislike women.
I just distrust them.
Distrust them, yeah, because it's the glint in the eye and the cyanide in the soup.
Yeah.
And I love the way he's opening the letters with this dagger.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the way he says cyanide in the soup, and he swishes the letter open in this massively dramatic way, which he seems to do with all the letters. It's like just such an over-exaggeration, but it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And then he's talking about because you've made me a hopeless dope fiend. Is because I occasionally take a 5%.
He says 5 because he knows that you've diluted it. Yeah.
7. He says no. He says, don't you think I know you've been diluting it?
Yeah. So he is a hopeless coke addict, but obviously, it's good. It's good, kind of like clearly Watson, as a doctor and a friend, cares about him and is trying to. Yeah.
So this is the thing. There's with the missing scenes.
Mm.
So there's one of the Wilder originally had. So it was going to be a 3-hour movie because it was one of those roadshow movies.
Mm.
But then when the roadshow movies started making losses, they kind of stopped doing them in the late 60s sort of thing. And they recut this just to be a standard cinema release. And basically they cut an entire hour out. And the original structure was it was going to be in like little cases. So basically they just removed most of them. There was a scene at the beginning with the bank where it was going to be Baker was playing a descendant of Watson who was picking up the paper.
He was finally being unsealed after the 50 years kind of deal.
So he sorry, Blakeney, not Baker. So he that was completely cut. And then there's a scene, there's a whole the case of the upside down room, which so Lestrade comes in and they're like, oh, it's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. You've got to come and see it. And he's drumming on his hat and like really irritating Holmes. And they go to see it, and there's this dead Chinaman, I think it is, on the floor, and this like all of the chairs and things and all that was all sort of stuck to the ceiling, and you know there's this elaborate stuff, and of course Holmes realizes that Watson has done this himself.
Yeah,
because he's bored. Holmes is bored, and they haven't had a decent case for a while, and he's just trying
to keep him. Yeah,
and he's trying to keep him off the dope by giving him something to do.
Yeah, well, and we get that here because he says like I only do coke when I'm bored, basically.
Yeah, and that whole scene kind of even more emphasizes the thing, because you do get a lot of scenes with coke use in this movie.
Oh yeah.
You don't see it specifically, but later, when they get there later, especially. But you have that sort of, enforced within that sort of, especially in that missing scene.
Yeah.
And in that scene is it's audio and only stills.
Yeah.
Whereas there's another one which is my favourite, the case of the horrific case of the naked honeymooners, which is
visual
but no sound.
Yeah.
They're both on YouTube. If you wish. The case of the upside down. Sorry, not the case of the honeymooners is particularly good and particularly funny. And I like that one very much. So give those a go as well.
It's funny when you look at it and you're like, well, this was originally like, I don't know, 5 cases or something. Because it is kind of odd. You do get you get reference here to the midgets disappearing, which they come back to later.
Yeah.
But then it goes into a different case, and it's kind of really uneven where you've got one really short case thing.
Yeah.
And then you get into the main case, and it's like, that was weird. But it makes more sense when you look at it now and you're like, oh, actually,
it should have been.
It was meant to be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so he says there's this urgent appeal for finding some midgets.
6 midgets. Yeah.
6 midgets. Yes, they're like an acrobatic act, and they've disappeared between London and Bristol.
Yeah, and I like he says what's wrong with that? He then goes on to this elaborate thing. Says, well, they're anarchists.
Yeah.
They're going to blow up the Tsar of Russia, and you can see Watson's face is like amazed.
He's like, wow, really?
No, he said they probably just joined another circus. Yeah. I like the way he says the guy offered me £5 to find them, because that's not even £1 a midget.
Yeah. Yeah, I really do like their relationship together.
Yeah, the dynamic is wonderful.
I also love when Mrs. Hudson comes back and Holmes has a go at her for dusting.
Mrs. Hudson, there's something missing on my table. And she's like, what? It's like, there is dust. You have dusted. He's like, of course I did. While you were away, I dusted. It's like,
but I love he says that's his way of dating things.
Yeah, it's his filing system, because I know everything is. He says the dust was this thick on that bit there, and he says that, and he goes, that's
March of 1883 is what he says. Yeah. That's such a good line. Really, really good. But yes, I think we then cut to him and his smoking contraption. He's doing his ash experiment, and Mrs. Hudson's like, he's gonna kill us. What is this? Like, what are you doing? And I think his Watson's like, no, he's doing work in ash. What does he say? Is like ash.
Yeah, it's recognition of what brand.
Study of tobacco ash, and Mrs. Hudson immediately says, "Oh, I'm sure their millions are crying out for that." Yeah. Like really important work.
Yeah, and you can see Holmes is bored of it. He's wandering around listlessly.
Yeah.
I like I like the way that you've got Watson sat at his writing desk. And Holmes is sort of pacing around him.
Yes.
And he goes and gets the violin out, which is another thing that he complains about. He says about, you've made me a virtuoso in the story. He says, well, I can barely hold a tune together. He says, there's a commission on there to join the Philharmonic or something.
Yeah.
But he takes it out and he starts playing, and I love the way that like the tune plays, and it's like the tune of the movie, which again. The soundtrack of this movie is so beautiful. It's amazing.
It is, yeah.
And he's playing, and I love the way Watson sort of, he settles in and he starts writing again, and then abruptly it all sort of comes crashing down. And he just stops and puts it away.
Yeah.
Pacing around him again, and then of course he goes to the
medicine bag.
Yeah. And I like he says. He says, aren't you ashamed? He says, yes, but this will take care of that.
Yeah. It's I don't know. I really like their relationship. Like I genuinely I think it's difficult because it's a very different Holmes than what I traditionally go for, but I think their relationship together works very well, which is kind of key to every Sherlock Holmes
I think that's the
story,
thing about this Holmes is that he feels he doesn't feel infallible, like
no, but you do get that feeling of like he is isolated because of his genius, and he doesn't really socialize with anyone or have anything to. And even Watson is like, if Watson wasn't there,
And there's even later when they're talking about mistakes, and he says, he says we all make mistakes. He says, but Watson never writes about mine.
Yes, thankfully.
And it's so firmly establishing that they've clearly had cases that went wrong.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sure there are. There certainly probably were in the within the canon of things. There certainly were, but not to the degree that they're suggesting here. They're suggesting that he's not the genius that Watson keeps portraying him as, which I really like.
Well, you also get here, and presumably this is all the stuff that's in the bank vault sealed box, opened 50 years later or whatever. Yeah. But you do get that occasional narration from Watson, and he does say, there was nothing I could ever do when he went into his cocaine binges except hope that a case would come along and snap him out of it and kind of help him out of it and stuff. And it's clear that while he didn't write about it publicly, he did write about it at least privately, his concerns and his love for his friend, Yeah. But the next day, I suppose, or morning, who knows, we do get Watson. They've got tickets to Swan Lake. And it's the final performance of Swan Lake, and of course Holmes is not interested whatsoever, and Watson's like, it's Swan Lake, it's not just it's not just ballet, it's like the ballet,
and it's Madame Petrova. She's like the best ever sort of thing.
Yeah,
he's beside himself, and Holmes is just like, it's so boring. It's like,
and then of course we cut to Swan Lake, which I always associate with Dracula. So whenever I hear, I think it's that like universal horror thing. Like I just cannot help but associate Swan Lake with Dracula.
It really annoys a lot of classical lovers.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
It's always been my association with Swan Lake as well. Yeah,
I just can't help it. But we do get a lovely bit here, when we get Watson saying, "Oh, it's not a swan, It's actually a lady. It's symbolizes a lady. It's not actually a swan, which of course we'll come back to later with the Loch Ness monster.
Yeah.
But it's nice foreshadowing. I thought that was quite well done. We see Holmes is just fucking yawning his way through the entire performance.
Yeah, he's barely keeping away.
Yeah, he's barely. But Watson, on the other hand, is like enchanted.
Yeah.
I love Watson's thing here is like in this movie is talking too much. Yep. Like there's that great bit later with the monks on the train, and he just won't stop talking to them, and they're.
It's not even. It's also that I love that he's eager to show how clever he is as well.
Oh yeah.
Because even in that bit, he says vow of silence. Yes. Trappist, isn't it? That's what they call you fellows, isn't it? Trappist. Yes. It's like he's wonderful in that sort of slightly overbearing but brilliant way.
I love that he says about the six the people that died.
11 people, yeah.
11. He says 12 and he lists 11, and
12, yeah.
And Sherlock's like, that's only 11. He's like, well, one of them fell out of a window and fell onto somebody.
I wrote this one down. He says there's 12 men have died for, and he says, really? He says 6 committed suicide, 4 were killed in duels, and 1 fell out of the gallery of the Viennese Opera House. He says, that's only 11. He says, yeah, that man fell on top of another man, the officer. And he goes, that makes an even dozen in a messy sort of way.
Yeah. But they are finally interrupted by a man who comes in and basically says that I think he's the director, isn't he, of the Russian ballet?
So. Yeah.
And he basically says, I'm glad you could accept the invitation. And he said, yeah, that's right. He says, I'm glad you could. I'm glad you could accept the invitation. And he says, like, oh, I would like you to come. Come with me. You're invited to come back. And Watson's like, oh, I'd love to. And he's like, yeah, you're invited to.
You're also invited. Yeah.
Yeah, you're also invited. Yeah.
It's the way he looks down at him out of the side of his eye and says, you are also invited.
Yeah. But he says that Madame Petrova has a problem.
I think that what we're saying with the relationship with those, what I like about this Holmes is he almost not goads exactly, but he waits for Watson to speak for him.
Yeah.
He waits for Watson to do all the silly stuff while he just sits back and stares at them.
Yes.
And says very little.
But his facial acting is all you need in those scenes.
Yeah. He's got such a way of sort of like, looking at them. And you can see in this sort of like, sometimes there's be like a little glint of a smile in the corner of his eyes, which is wonderful. Yeah. And I think it's because they'd worked together previously. And I think it was Stevens who recommended Blakely because they'd worked in the theatre together.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. So I think that my guess is they were very good at bouncing off each other, and they probably worked on, how they were coming up with this.
Yeah.
You do get these wonderful little bits where Watson just barrels over every conversation, and Holmes amused sort of stands back and watches.
Yeah. So after the performance, obviously they're asked to come backstage for this little party, and that she's going to be waiting for them, or specifically for Holmes. So Holmes and Watson head back, and immediately he says, "Oh, Madame is waiting for you, Sherlock," and he says, "Mr. Watson, you can entertain yourself in the meantime." And he's like, "Oh, we've got vodka and what does he say? Vodka and girls." And he's like, "Oh no, I couldn't." Yeah. He's like, "What? No girls?" He's like, "Oh no, girls." He's like, "Oh yeah, definitely do girls." He's like, "Oh no, it's caviar, isn't it?" He's like, "The caviar turns his stomach." Yeah. And he's like, "No caviar."
None of you speak English yet. What? None of you? Not a word yet. And it's like, I think they probably do. At least a little. And he says, "Oh, you've all got nice popos," he says.
Yeah, and then starts hitting them just to make sure that they're aware. So Holmes is taken into the back where he meets Madame, and a very awkward conversation takes place. So Madame Petrova is This is not only the last performance of Swan Lake, this is her last performance ever.
Yeah.
She is retiring to have a family. And Holmes is initially like, oh, good for you, you know.
Yeah,
well done.
Nice.
Nice.
I love the way the guy says, she's 38. Because really? She doesn't look
Yeah, it's like, that's because she's 48.
She's 49.
I'm 49, yeah. I must admit, this film has some great comedy to it.
I think it's because my guess is, well, not my guess, but it's because I think it's Billy Wilder.
Yeah.
Wilder, wonderful. You know.
Yeah.
His movies are just so. I mean, Some Like It Hot is one of the best movies ever made.
It's such a great movie.
You know, it's undeniably an absolute classic, and even what's the what's it called? The one with the two guys living in the. Is it? Oh, for fuck's sake!
I know what you mean, but I am equally not remembering.
The Apartment, for fuck's sake.
Well done.
It is The Apartment.
Um,
yes, not the one I was thinking of, but yes, The Apartment is one of the ones. Is a fucking great movie too. But yeah, he's a great comedic. You know,
timing, I think, in his direction.
Yeah,
because he also wrote it as well, or part wrote it.
Mm-hmm. And it's a very sort of it's that sort of thing of I think what foreign directors do with American. Sure, you know, they make those, like, you know, the obvious one would be something like for fuck's sake, this is not going well for me.
Don't worry, it's just one of those days.
RoboCop.
Yeah.
Something like RoboCop and the foreign directors' way
commentary of America, and
the way that he does, you know, the British is quite funny and quite satirical.
I love that. I love it when Madame Petrova says that she's heard all about Holmes, and that her favourite story is the one of the big dog from Baskerville.
Yeah.
And Holmes is like, I think something was lost in the translation.
Yeah.
Because of course she's been reading all of Watson's stories, presumably translated. And Holmes is initially like very happy for it, and then he is offered the Stradivarius. And he looks at it and he's like, "Oh my goodness!
What do you make of this?" Yeah.
Yeah, and of course he says it's a fine instrument. It's obviously an original, and is very expensive. And of course the director says, "Hey, you know, it's yours. Take it." And he's like, "I couldn't possibly." And he's like, "Well, you know, take it in kind in payment for your service." And he says, "Well, my rates are high, but not like Stradivarius high." And then the penny drops. Then he realizes, oh, you haven't started your family yet. You want to start a family. You're looking for someone to start a family with. And then we basically get.
he basically says, well, wouldn't you rather have someone else, you know, other than me? He says, well,
we've tried everyone.
Yeah, you weren't our first choice. First we went to Tolstoy. You went, perfect, the man's a genius. It's like, yeah, he's too old. Mm-hmm. And then we went to, is it Nietzsche? And I can't remember what he says the problem with Nietzsche was.
I can't remember what he says about Nietzsche.
He says it was catastrophe.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think he elaborates. He just said it was terrible. He said then they went to Tchaikovsky. And he says, was it ladies aren't Tchaikovsky's glass of tea?
Glass of tea, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so basically she wants to have a brilliant son.
Yeah, she wants her beauty and Sherlock's brains.
Yes, yeah. And basically, yeah, as you said, they've gone through everyone and they've decided it must be Holmes because he is the best mind they could find.
Yeah.
And of course Holmes, I guess, somewhat desperate to find a way out of this situation, whether he's homosexual in this or not. He wants nothing to do with this situation regardless.
Yeah.
And so he says he starts trying to come up with problems. What was the first excuse he uses? He bleeds, isn't it? That he bleeds a lot.
He's a bleeder.
He's a bleeder.
He was feeling, and I like. She says she will not scratch you.
Yeah. And eventually he's like, oh well, no, look, I need to. Oh no, sorry. First we do get. Sorry, I've just seen it and it's reminded me. You get the great bit where Watson comes in with the flower in his hair.
Yeah. What does? Oh, he says. What does something mean? And you little devil is. What
yeah.
Yeah.
And he's very pleased that that's what it means. He's like, oh, am I? Kind of walks out all happy.
Cutting back to Watson in the middle of this, bevy of girls doing like almost like a can around the stage.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. And he's got that flower in his hair. It is brilliant. And I like the when they're drinking, the guy pulls out the vodka, like red vodka, and they drink it, and Holmes is like, "What the hell's that?" And he says, "Because what does it taste like?" He says, "Is this pepper?" And he says, "Yes."
Yeah. So the bleeding doesn't work. Yep. So eventually he says, "Look, I'm taken. There's the problem is that I'm a taken man." And he says, "But you're a bachelor." And he says, "Yes, I'm a bachelor who's lived with a man for the last
5 years.
Yeah, the decade or whatever.
Five very happy years.
Yeah.
And he says, "Is it not just Tchaikovsky? Just what you're saying is Watson
is your glass of tea." Yeah. And he says, "Yes, yeah." And he says, look, I'd rather disappoint you now than disappoint you.
Gondola in Venice.
Yeah, the gondola in Venice. He said it would be a catastrophe. Of course, he quotes them saying it would be a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And so, of course, he leaves, and he heads back through to find Watson, who is having the time of his fucking life, dancing with these girls, and. Yeah. Holmes is like, look, we're leaving. And he's like, not a chance. I am not leaving.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. But you get this really... I find this scene really funny. The scene where the girls discover that Watson is presumably homosexual because of what Holmes has said.
Yeah.
And of course, they just want to please Watson.
First, I love the fact that you get... So when Sherlock leaves the room, Madame Jojo has a fucking full-on meltdown.
Oh, yeah.
Screaming at what is the bloody guy's name?
I don't know. He's like the director general.
Rogozin. And he sort of, you can see him like miserable when Holmes is saying we're going home to him. You can see him skulking around in the background.
Yeah.
I love the way he sort of picks up a bottle of vodka and sort of he's sort of knocking it back, and he taps one of the girls and you see him whispering into her ear. And I love the way it all goes round the girls. They're all whispering in their ears, and it slowly goes. What I love is they've got these
the guy. I love the first guy that they tell, and he's like, "Oh, okay, we could deal with this problem."
You've got these tiny little girls, and she leans up
to like the tallest man in the world.
He's like 6'3" or something, and he comes down, and it's like, and I love this expression on his face when he finds it out.
He's like really impressed.
Like,
but I really love
sort of thing.
I really love the dance. And how it's like slowly but surely they're all replaced by men, but Watson's always looking in the wrong direction, so he doesn't notice until it's completely men.
And I love the way they form a circle. They're dancing with them all facing in, except for Watson, who's facing out.
Yes, yeah. It's such a good visual gag.
Yeah.
And you get that wonderful moment where he suddenly realizes, and he's like,
he's like, wait a moment. Where'd the girls go?
So of course he tries to, because he also tries to approach the girls afterwards, and they all just walk away. It's like the parting of the Red Sea. And he says, "Well, Mr. Holmes has explained everything," because the director was there. He's like, "Yeah, you don't have to hide from us. He's like, it may be unusual between doctors and detectives, but." In the theatre, in ballet, this is perfectly normal.
He says, Alexei, like it goes along the lines.
Oh yeah, and the last one, yeah.
Is it Andre or something? Andre,
50-50.
Away.
But yeah, so Watson obviously realizes that this has been said about him and is furious to the point that he presumably runs all the way home in anger.
I love that. You get him, you could like angrily running all the way there.
Drunk, angry running. Yeah. And still with the flower in his hair.
Yeah.
which stays there despite him having the top hat on as well.
And it cuts to Holmes sat in the chair.
Yeah, because he hears him running, doesn't he?
Yeah, and he can hear him coming, and he gets up and he starts moving the furniture around. He's like, he turns the chair around so it's facing the window.
Yeah.
And then you don't quite see what he does, but you see him moving things around, and the Watson just starts screaming for him as soon as he comes through the front door.
Yeah, and he's like, "How dare you come up with these incredible fabrications?" And he's really fuming. But I love that he throws something at Holmes's pipe.
Yeah.
And when the pipe lands on the floor, he's genuinely worried for Sherlock. He's like, "Oh my God, Sherlock, are you okay?"
Of course, I hurt. Yeah.
And it shows that he really does care for him. Despite how much it like this man drives him insane, he does have a deep care for him. But of course, he gets there and he realizes, as we realized, a few seconds earlier, it's his smoking machine that he'd set up.
And he's got.
Holmes is sat in the corner and he's just like, "Well, I heard your angry footsteps, and I assumed you'd be like,
He's still in the shadow working the bellows with his foot, isn't he?
Yeah. And he says, "Oh, you have my most abject apologies. I couldn't, I had to be some way I could get out of that situation without hurting her feelings."
Yeah.
But of course, Watson's horrified. He's like, "What about my reputation?"
Yeah.
I mean, this is the 1800s.
If it gets back to the regiment, they'll drum me out.
Yeah, but this is. Yeah. I mean, this is late 1800s, right? So yeah. And of course, so Watson's trying to think of ways to kind of get out of this.
And eventually he's like, actually, we can sue them because no one will believe that. Because if they do, we'll sue them for slander.
Yeah, and he also says, "Well, we're going to have to do something." And Holmes is like, "Well, you could start by taking the flower out of your hair."
That's right. He says we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to get married. And he goes, "Well, that's not going to help, is it?" Yeah, he does say about the flower. He says they might want to get rid of the flower.
I love it. And then he's like saying about how they couldn't be around each other anymore, and Holmes then starts making it sound like a sexual love affair, where he's like, "Oh, we could still meet in like clandestine, railway stations and parks and stuff, clandestine meetings in Hyde Park and stuff."
Yeah.
Yeah, it is great. I genuinely love their performance together in this scene. I think it's really, really
wonderful.
funny.
It's so funny, and then it does turn. I love the way it turns because, up until this point, Holmes is amused by Watson and his.
Well, this is the one point he takes it very seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sherlock goes to sort of go to bed, and Watson says, if I may be, if it isn't being presumptuous, and he's rolling his hands when he's saying this.
Yeah.
There have been women, you have been with women, haven't you?
And he says the answer is yes. And of course,
around to him, he says the answer is yes, and it's the way he says it. It's really angry. And he says you're being presumptuous, and he just walks away. And I love that delivery. It's
great.
Fucking absolute spot on.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does, like you said, of all of the Holmes adaptations, this is the one you could certainly make the argument that, he may well be gay. And it works really well in this film, I think.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, because the performance is quite camp anyway.
Yeah.
It really does work.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we kind of awkwardly jump to the next case. He kind of says, "Oh, it was several years later," and kind of moves on. And Holmes and Watson are just kind of, again, bored. I think Holmes is playing violin again. And they get a knock on the door.
Yeah, and I like that. So, who'd be there? Who are you expecting someone? Not at this hour. And I love the way Watson says, Mrs. Hudson must be entertaining. And again, very cattily, Sherlock says, really? I've never found her so.
Yeah. So there's is it a taxi driver, I think?
Yeah, he's a cab driver.
And he's like, well, you owe me fare. And he's like, what for? He's like, for the lady. He's like, what lady? And of course he just brings in this woman. This is a Bulgarian woman, isn't it?
She's Belgian.
Oh, Belgium. Sorry, Belgium. And
I mean, she's not speaking.
She was found in the Thames.
Yeah. He pulled her up. And I like. He says, "Oh, you owe me this." He goes, do you want her or not? And I like the way that Holmes is stood on the sort of the top of the stairs and he's looking down, and it almost, you can sort of see it going through his mind. He's like, it almost looks like whether he's gauging whether this is going to be
interesting,
involved in or not. You know, he's got that sort of like that look that says, is this going to be one of the interesting ones, or is this just going to be some lunatic who tried to drown herself?
Yeah. Well, he even asks, he's like, why did you bring her here? And he's like, well, because, you know, once I got her out of the river and she stopped fighting me off, there was a note and it said 21B Baker Street.
Yeah.
She basically just, all she says is that she doesn't remember, right? That's pretty much all she says. But obviously Watson's worried for this woman. He is a doctor after all.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, you know, shall I throw her back, or are you going to pay this fee? Because he says I had to dive in after her, and she was fighting me off and stuff.
And what I really like is once they paid him up, and he says he takes the blanket off at her, and he says, "I won't charge you for the use of the horse blanket."
Yeah. So Watson takes her in, and you know, Holmes kind of doesn't really do anything, stays at arm's distance. But we do get the scene of the taxi driver leaving and someone ominously looking. Someone is watching on.
Well, it turns round, and then somebody he's looking in the door, and then he gets back. He gets into the taxi, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And I love this sort of bit where you've got Sherlock trying to figure out what nationality is. And he says, "Oh, are you French?" And she says, "No." And he says, "Are you Swiss?" And she says, "No." And he says, "Belgian." And she says that. And then Mrs. Hudson comes in, and I think Watson says, "Oh, she's Belgian." And Mrs. Hudson goes, "Oh, the poor dear."
But yes, so they're trying to kind of work out where she's come from. I think she's got some print, some scrap.
Yeah, they find that later, the print, don't they?
But it's kind of worn off from the river.
The back of the label's got something that's the water has washed off, and it's you see the thing on her hand later. But at this point, I think that Watson says, "Oh, we'll put her in my room," and Mrs. Hudson just looks at him. It's like, "I'll sleep on the couch."
Yeah. They also try and work out, because they're like, "Oh, she's got a cut on her head. Like, you know, she must have done it in the fall." And he's like, "No, it's already coagulated. This must have been before." And they believe that she might have temporary amnesia. Is the kind of theory that Watson's going with it at the very least.
And you again, almost sort of like to reinforce the sort of the relationship angle. What Watson clearly wants her to keep her here, and Holmes is like, no, we've got to send her to a hospital. It's like, no, I can see to her, I can attend to her medically. It's like, he says, yeah, but we can't have the place cluttered up with women. We don't want women hanging around us.
Yeah.
And Watson's like, no, we've got to keep her here.
Yeah. I think they also find the ring, don't they? Because she's got the ring.
Yes, she has a brass.
And he says, "Oh, is your name Gabriella?" Because that's in the
because it's got Emile and Gabrielle written inside it, hasn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, as you said, they take her away, and Mrs. Hudson takes her away at first, doesn't she?
Yeah.
And they said like Holmes is almost like, well, when can we get rid of her? And it's like you know, Watson's like, well, it depends on the severity of her injuries. You know, we'll have to see how she is. You know.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, we need to solve this as soon as possible. We can't wait, and you know, it's
the sooner we can get her out, the better, sort of thing.
Yeah, pretty much. The sooner I can get this lady out of my life, the better.
Yeah. I think he said something. It's only a small flat. I think he says, isn't it?
Yeah. But yes. So the following morning, I think we cut to the next morning. Then.
Yeah, we get that. So she comes. It's actually during the night, I think.
Is it during the night? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, she comes in the night. She comes out naked.
Yeah.
And she starts calling for a meal.
Mm-hmm.
And Holmes basically pretends to be a meal, as it were, and she comes over to him, and there's a whole sort of conversation they have about, you know, that how she's missed him and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And he's getting clues, and that's when he sees her hand and he sees that. You know, the back of the ticket had gone onto her hand, and he works out like the next clue, as it were, to her identity.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a very sort of, it's an odd scene because, you know, he's being very careful not to get too sort of like close, as it were, but he
wants to solve the case. That's all he's interested in.
Yeah.
Because she starts talking about her negligee, doesn't she?
The pink negligee with feathers.
Negligee. Yeah. And then he starts saying, well, you know, where is your address, and where, you know, he starts trying to kind of get some information out of her. And as you said, then he sees the print has come off on her hands, and obviously then has a little bit more of, you know, the next clue, as you say.
Yeah.
We do see Watson, true to his word, did sleep on the sofa. He has knackered his back, and I love that it's like physician heal thyself. Where he's like, Mrs. Hudson, can you? But he basically tells her how to fix his own back, because he's like,
Mrs. Hudson, can you
put this in the small.
Between the fifth and fourth vertebrae, it's like she fucking knows. Which one that is.
I love it. That's so great.
It's like, really, put your arms under mine, really pull. No, more than that. And I like that they go into wake up the woman, and she's
not there. Yeah, so he's like, oh my god, Holmes, and runs in and obviously finds her in Holmes's room, and he's like aghast. He's like pointing, like, oh my god.
Yeah. He genuinely thinks Sherlock's taken advantage of her. He's horrified.
Yeah.
And of course, Holmes then walks in with a big case,
complaining about porridge. He's like, oh, I smell porridge, lumpy as usual, I suppose.
Eat it before it gets cold and lumpy. And he comes in and says, oh, because Mrs. Hudson's made porridge. I presume it's lumpy.
Yeah. Of course, Mrs. Hudson leaves, and he says, yeah, I'm surprised I wasn't expecting you to take advantage of her. And he's like, well, maybe I did, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he's like, yeah, you know, Holmes, this is reprehensible. Like, you know, you need where's your professional ethics? And
he explains that he worked out that it was a luggage label, and that it came from the.
But I love that he winds Watson up first, though, because he's like, oh, I found her body very interesting or very revealing or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, he really fucking lays it on. But then, yeah, as you said, he says about the palm of the hand.
I think that's another thing. This Holmes. I mean, Holmes has a great sense of humour, and you see it in almost all versions.
Yeah.
But it's usually a sort of, you know, he only lets it out every now and again. This Holmes
he's on all the time, man.
Yeah, he absolutely adores winding up Watson in this.
Yeah, you feel like Watson's the one person that puts up with all of his shit. And he kind of loves him for it, and he knows that he can always do that.
That's true of pretty much true of all versions, but
for sure.
But for different reasons, I think. In this one, certainly, this Watson puts up with him being the butt of Sherlock's, you know, amusement.
Yeah. So he carried in this luggage, which he's now found. He's found her luggage. And they start opening it. They find the pink negligee. And they find a load of letters. And he's like, we're finally getting somewhere. And of course they see her name is Gabrielle. I forget the last name. Valadon. And her husband was Emily Valadon.
Yeah.
And so now she's kind of got her memory back, and she's like, "Where am I?" And he's like, "Well, you're at 22B Baker Street." And she's like, "Oh, so you're Sherlock Holmes, and you must be Watson." And then she kind of almost faints.
Mm-hmm.
But they're trying to get somewhere. So Watson's like, "I'll get you a strong coffee. You just wait there." And then Holmes is like, well, right, let's try and sort this out. So you've come to London. You were on business. You were looking for business, and she's like, yes. He's a mining engineer. She says that he was involved in a copper mine. Is that right?
Yeah, that's where the rings sort of come from.
Because the ring's copper, and he's like, oh yeah, but which comes up later, of course, the copper ring. It is. There are quite a few nice little bits in this that do kind of link to later.
Mm-hmm.
They do quite a good job of establishing some stuff.
They do a very good job of laying all the little bits.
The groundwork, yeah.
Nicely.
Yeah, I think so.
Not too clever and not too stupid.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, is always a good balance for a detective thing. If you make the clues too, obscure, then you can't play the game. But if you make them too stupid, then what's the point?
Yeah. So she says that they were married. She was married to this copper miner, and that they lived apart and were exchanging letters.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the letters stopped.
She says that he was working on an air pump for the.
Yes, that's right. She was sending letters and receiving letters, and then all of a sudden the letters stopped. So at that point, she decided, she would go and visit, presumably just concerned. And of course, Holmes has got the letters, hasn't he? And he's like, oh yeah, 32 Ashdown Street. And she's like, yeah, that's where it was. And she said she just found an empty store there in the end. There was nobody there. So she went around to try to find Jonah Limited. But the whole company doesn't exist, so none of it exists. And you can see that Holmes is getting more and more interested now. He's like, "Oh, this is actually an intriguing case.
This is a proper case."
Yeah. I think Holmes even tries to make out well, maybe he just left you, and she's like, "No, he loves me, and I love him. That's not what's happened."
Yeah.
And I think she's gone to the police already, and they were going to do a missing persons, but she basically doesn't have any faith, which is why she's come to Holmes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then on the way there, she suddenly heard footsteps, and then she was in the river.
Yeah.
Or sorry, there was chloroform, and then she ended up in the river.
Oh yes, the chloroform, yes.
Yeah. And she basically says, I don't understand any of it. I don't know what the fuck happened. And she kind of begs Holmes. She's like, what has happened? You must help me find my husband. I don't understand what's going on. And of course, Holmes says, well, we'll do our best. He basically says, I want you to send another letter to your husband.
She starts writing. She puts the address down, and then she says, "What shall I say?" And he says, "It doesn't matter."
Yeah, he says, but doesn't he say, "Do not say nothing"?
Yeah. He folds it up, and he basically, says that it's not an address. They go there, and it's for a drop. He thinks it's a drop.
Yeah. He basically says it's a front. There's no one lives there. So they head to 32 Ashdown Street and break in effectively. That like Holmes has brought along his own metal saw to saw through the.
It's the cane he's got is really cool because it's.
It doesn't. Oh god!
Into a hammer.
What does Mycroft call it later on? Your toolkit. That's right. I loved that line. That was a great line.
Because it's got a saw in it, and the top turns into a hammer. It's wonderful. and he saws through the bars of one of the windows.
Mm. Yeah, it's like the skylight, isn't it? Almost.
Yeah, and he uses a chisel. Yes, it is. It's a skylight. Yeah, and I love the way he cuts through most of them, chisels the last two, and they just pry it open, and it's really cool. And they lower themselves down into this
clearly abandoned,
empty and abandoned room with just there seem to be tracks
and the sound of birds,
and a massive cage full of covered canaries.
Yeah, and they kind of ponder for a second. Maybe it's just maybe it's a pet shop.
Yeah. And I like the way he says what they're looking at the tracks, and he says, maybe it's someone. I think it was someone on an ice skate if there was some ice around.
Yeah. And then of course, while they're there, the letter arrives. And they watch the postman post it through the door. And then Holmes is like, oh, now comes the most nerve-wracking part of detective work, doing nothing.
Yeah. That actually does remind me, there's a thing he says earlier on, actually, which I really liked. At the very beginning when they're talking to Mrs. Hudson and stuff, and he's opening the letters and things, and he says about, catching a criminal is very much like catching a head cold. You never know when you're going to get one.
Yeah.
I just thought that's a great line.
There are some really good lines in this, I must admit. And they can't figure out what the tracks are because there aren't footprints. There's like tracks going around. And doesn't Holmes even say I thought it was ice skates, except but of course they hear the door unlatching, and they all hide.
They hear singing, don't they? I think it's like singing or whistling.
Oh, I thought they heard the chair, but yeah, okay. Well, one way or the other. But I love they hide behind the sliding doors. The door kind of slides in front of them.
Yeah.
And of course this old lady comes in, singing and talking to her birds, and she starts
a creaky wheelchair.
Yes, her very creaky wheelchair. And she's like, oh, you never told me we had a letter, or I had a letter. And of course she starts looking down at the letter that's just been posted. When suddenly even more people turn up. And I think it's quite a well-directed, tense scene when they're hiding behind this door. And they're kind of, because you see them looking from one side to the other side as they kind of track the people coming in.
Perfectly placed hole for Holmes's eye to actually see what's going on.
Yeah.
Through the door.
I love the guys come in and they're like, "What have you been up to?" And she's like, "Dancing lessons. What do you think?" Yeah. And she says, what's going on up there? Like, why do you want my birds?
Page, don't they take some of the birds?
Yeah.
She says, "How many do you need?" And he says, "Just as a dozen or something."
Yeah. And she says,
said, "What do they do up there?" And he's like, basically, like, his answer's like above his pay grade and it sort of thing. It's like, yeah, we don't ask.
But Holmes notices, as they're taking the birds out, the newspaper in the bottom of the cage, in the bottom of their cage that they're transferring the birds into, is like an Inverness paper.
Yeah, is it the Inverness or Argyle Post or something? Something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, a local newspaper that tips him off as to where the birds are ending up, at least. So the old lady leaves the letter, and she ends up leaving. Effectively then they all kind of exit out from behind the door. And I love, because this is one of the things you always find in movies. It's always like a pet peeve of mine. The very second that people leave the room, people start talking at normal volume.
Yeah,
and it's like, that's not a good idea. But here, Watson is quiet. He does whisper, and he's like, this is crazy. But he is actually whispering, which I like. It was a nice touch. And they even stop when she comes, because she comes around the front as well, and you see her shadow.
Yeah.
And they stop talking to let her go past. So they're like, well, what's going on here? Where are they taking the birds? And Holmes says, well, Inverness or Scotland would be my guess because of the newspaper.
Yeah.
the Inverness Courier, and then Gabrielle is like, oh, this letter, it's addressed to you, and Holmes is like, addressed to me. He's like, well, that's impossible. Like we sent it to ourselves, and Holmes is like, well, nevertheless, and of course he opens it, and it's from Mycroft. And I love that he's like, I expect you to see this upon I expect you to come to me upon receipt of this, which will be at 11:40. And Watson's like, well, my watch says 11:43, and he's like, well, if I know Mycroft, you should adjust your watch.
You need to,
because he's like, either Mycroft miscalculated or your watch is wrong, and I think you should change your watch. So yeah, they have been summoned to see Mycroft, played by my favorite actor of all time, Christopher Lee.
Yeah, the Diogenes,
who I think is a tremendous Mycroft.
Yeah,
really like his Mycroft in this. It's always weird, like Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing. They've done so many Holmes, and like they're all kinds of roles.
Well, I think as we've said before.
Well, I think we said it in The Hound of the Baskervilles, didn't we?
Yeah, Lee's one of the only actors to ever play Holmes, Mycroft, and Henry Baskerville.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
I can't imagine there are many that have played like two, let alone three of those characters. So
I love on their way in to meet Mycroft. There's the guy passed out on the chair. with the ash, and he's like, oh, it's Jamaican whatever, and he's like still going on with his ash thing.
I like they come in, and there's the one-armed guy on the desk, and he says, right, gentlemen, if you just sign in, and they just fucking
they just go straight upstairs. Straight up the stairs. And I love that there's that awesome, I love that. I mean, I would fucking go in my house. It would take up too much room, but that fucking there's that awesome statue of a young Victoria being crowned by an angel. Yes,
it's like, oh, that's so good. That is such a cool statue, and I love that it just completely puts you know exactly where you are in this set of rooms. And they go upstairs, and there's all those busts of, like, I'm sure one of them might be Wellington, and there's just books everywhere, and there's all these old gents sort of either asleep or sort of like just not saying anything, because that's what one of the rules of the Diogenes is that no one speaks, no one pays attention to each other.
Yeah. So of course Mycroft kind of immediately shows off. He gives them this really old drink.
Yeah. The was it 1814 Madeira, I think it is, isn't it?
Doesn't he say there's like 6 in the world or something? He's got 3, and he's trying to get the other 3.
I think I'm going for another one. I think he says something like that. And I love the fact that he's even using a device to pour it.
Yes. Yeah.
He's not pouring it himself. He's got this, and when you first see Lee, he's there winding this handle, and you can see the joy in his eyes as he's winding this little handle, and it's slowly like tipping the bottle to pour it. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I love, like, Sherlock's clearly not really that bothered by the wine, but Watson's like, wow, this is like the best wine ever.
Well, and of course you realise that it's all been staged for pretty much for Mycroft's amusement. He's just kind of taking a dig at them that he knows what the fuck's going on. And I love he leads them down this path, because he's like, do you know what? He was like, oh, this. He's like, how old is this? And he says the age, and he's like, oh, it's 1 year before Waterloo.
Yeah.
And Watson's like, oh my goodness, Waterloo! Imagine that. And Mycroft's like, yeah, do you know where Waterloo even is? And he's like, oh, Belgium, isn't it? And he's like, yes, exactly. Which obviously is just a tip of the hat that he knows exactly the case that they're dealing with, because obviously she's a Belgian woman, right? And yeah, so he says, he basically says, I can help you in your case. I have a suggestion for you. Fuck off.
Yeah.
Like, don't get involved in this case.
Drop it. Yeah.
And he says, we're dealing with it. And he says it involves national security.
I think this is one of the first movies to show Mycroft as and the Diogenes as a government
Yeah, because they pretty much almost say it outright here, don't they?
Yeah, because it's kind of it's almost taken as read these days that
Yeah.
Mycroft is, but it's never really said in the book. There are hints that he works for the government and has dealings with them, but in the stories it's never really said that it is. It was later stories from other people that sort of put that in their head, and then this I think was the first on screen.
Yeah, confirmation,
and then of course it becomes much more. Mark Gatiss, who wrote,
we played Mycroft as well, didn't he?
And played Mycroft, exactly. This is his favourite Sherlock.
Oh, okay.
He adores it, and he said I've seen a lot of interviews where he talks about this movie, and he said that this and the Basil Rathbone Sherlocks informed Sherlock more than any other portrayal, as it were. And he said he basically chose to play his version of Mycroft as Lee plays Mycroft here.
Yeah, yeah.
Which you can see. You can totally see that if you watch the Sherlock, which varying degrees of. I thought he was a very good Mycroft actually in that show.
Gatiss.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought he was great.
Until you get to the wilder bits with the sister and that.
But again, it's that season 1 stuff.
Yeah, the season 1 is great. I'd happily watch season 1 again. The rest I can fuck off, really.
I now the more we're talking about it, the more it's making me want to rewatch that first season. Like only the first season, but I do actually. I'm like, oh, that was really good actually.
Yeah.
I do love that Mycroft says, "Oh, I so rarely get to see my brother," and
yes.
and Watson's like, "Well, you live in the same city," and he's like, "Yes," and I think his Holmes is like, "Yeah, but in different worlds."
Yeah, we don't live in the same. Yeah, basically the same circle, sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, you do get the impression of complete disdain.
Yeah.
From this Mycroft and for the way that Sherlock uses his powers of observation and stuff and
wasted.
Yeah. Which is obviously not the first version of that particular thing. It's kind of established that, but
yeah,
it just feels more vicious here from Lee's Mycroft.
Yeah. Holmes questions though. He kind of pushes back and he says, what exactly is Jonah Limited? And Mycroft again is like, I told you to drop this, drop it. And he says it's not just a suggestion, it's an order.
Yeah.
And he says, like, by whose authority? And he says, by Her Majesty's government. That's it.
And again, what I love is Watson's reaction immediately. The soldier in him comes out.
Yes.
He immediately it's an order.
That's that. Done. Yeah.
It's from the government. It's from the government. It's an order. We're done here, sort of thing.
Yeah. And then you get that wonderful line, as we said earlier. Here's you forgot your toolkit.
Yeah.
With the cane. Which is great. I do love that. Is this the only film that does that gimmick? The cane gimmick?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Thinking about it,
I can't think of any other time.
He certainly had cool tools before, and lock picks and all that sort of stuff. Specifically, this kind of no, I don't think so. I've seen him use sword canes.
Yes.
But
not, this is like Rambo's
not
knife.
Sword hammer. It's very specific. Yeah, it's to my remembrance. Although I've not seen. I don't think anybody could have seen every version of Sherlock, but
I probably seen the least out of the two of us, which is why I was asking you, because I thought you'd probably know more than I would.
Yeah, certainly this particular style of cane. No, I haven't seen anywhere else because it is very cool and very specific. But yeah, sword cane's definitely not tools so much.
And then he works out that they're going to the Valley of the Yew Tree, the boxes, right? Is that right?
Oh yes, that's right. One of the guys comes in, doesn't he?
Yeah, because he comes in with the letter. He's like, urgent letter.
And it's the boxes go to. Oh, I wrote it down. What is it called?
I think it's the Valley of the Yew Tree or something.
Yeah,
like
but
that.
it's in Scottish, isn't it?
Oh
So
yeah, I don't know the Scottish.
Glennahury, I think it is. Glennahury.
Mm.
He says the boxes go to the Glennahury and something goes up to the castle.
Mm.
Isn't it? He says.
And I love when they get back to the front door.
Yeah.
And Watson's like, "You are going to drop the case, aren't you, Holmes?" And Holmes is like, "Open that door." And as soon as they open it, Mrs. Hudson just puts a gun out the door.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Careful, Mrs. Hudson, you're liable to lose 2 excellent tenants." And she's like, of course, she's like massively relieved. And she's like, "Oh, you'll be relieved to know it's not." Oh, sorry, Holmes says, doesn't he? He's like, "Oh, you'll be relieved to know it's not loaded."
Yeah. I love the one where she says, "Have you ever tried doing embroidery with a gun in your hand?"
Yeah. And I think Holmes, like, Watson's like, you're not gonna disobey Mycroft, are you? And he's like, "Oh, he's just my brother." And Watson's like, "He's not just your brother. He works for the government. Like, he's like, he's like high up in the government." And obviously, Watson, like you said, he's gone into soldier mode where he's like, I must be careful." But yeah, so they basically decide, or well, at least Holmes has decided this is going to happen.
Yeah, and he explains that, was it Glen means valley of, isn't it? Then is of. Sorry, Glen is valley, is of the, and Hui, I think it's Hui, is yew tree.
Mm.
So yeah, the valley of the yew tree.
Yeah. And so they head up to see Gabrielle, and he says, like, "Well, basically, this is the plan. We're going to put you on a boat, a boat train. Off you go." And she's like, "I thought you were going to help me, you know." And she's like, "Well, I thought you were the great detective,
isn't he?" Watson's delighted when he hears that they're going to put her on a boat.
Well, because he thinks that's the case over, and they're dropping it. You know, he doesn't want to go up against his own government.
No.
And of course, I love that Holmes lets her rant for a while, and then he's like, "Are you quite finished?" And he said, I said we were going to put you on the train, didn't say you were going to stay on it."
Yeah.
And it basically says, "Well, it's 7:30 or whatever it is. We'll be saying goodbye to you, and then at like 8 o'clock or whatever, Mr. and Mrs. Ashdown will be accompanied by their valet Jean."
Yeah.
And of course, then she's delighted. The roles are reversed, because then she's delighted and Watson's fucking pissed off.
Watson really, also, you can tell Watson really hates the idea of being his valet as well.
Yeah. She tries to get a bit like flirty with him at that point. And it's clear that he only meant it as a disguise, because he's instantly like, "There's no need for that."
Yeah.
And yeah, so he's like, you know, Watson's trying his best. He's like, "Are you really interested in this nonsense?" You know, and she's like really, really trying to convince Holmes to drop it, but it's never going to happen.
No.
But it is quite funny that all of a sudden the roles are reversed, where it's Watson that doesn't want anything to do with this woman now that he's been told by Mycroft. He's like, no, that's it.
Yeah. It almost feels like a sort of a spiteful brother thing now, isn't it? It's that sort of the sibling, like, "Oh, my older brother told me not to do this, so I'm fucking definitely going to do this."
Yeah. But as he comes back in the room, Gabriella says, "Oh, I can't find it." And he's like, "What?" And she's like, "Oh, my other glove." And so he's like, "Oh, I'll help you look for it." And so he starts looking while she takes her parasol and goes to the window and starts opening it. At this stage, presumably just to air it. But we do see outside there is someone in a cab kind of waiting and watching.
Yeah, the guy that we saw earlier.
The same guy. Hasn't changed his clothes.
Same cabbie as well.
Yeah. He's getting good business. Yes, so off the train goes, and you do get that kind of awkward exchange with Sherlock's getting into his night dress.
Yes.
And he's basically told her to look away. And she's like, "Oh, you can look now."
she says about, do I embarrass you and all that sort of stuff.
Mm.
And he says, it may surprise you to know that I once slept with 121 women.
Yeah.
In a harem, wasn't it? And then that's partial of that is the a removed section.
Oh, really?
A bigger explanation. You don't see the specific case, but you have them explaining stuff about it and how Watson says that he can never. I think Watson says he's writing this one down, but he's changing all the things. He's not setting it in Turkey, I think it is. He's setting it in somewhere else, and he's changing it in from a harem to a school or something, and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But yeah, so you do get a bit more information about that specific case.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Watson is riding carriage, and comes across the monks.
Yeah.
And I love he walks in and he's like, "Oh, are you monks, friars, abbots?" He's like gonna go through every combination.
Sure how he should address them.
Yeah. And I love he hangs his umbrella up in the racking.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, are you really going to try and sleep with that thing constantly hitting you in the back of the head? Because it's like it's just like right on in his face.
Also, I love that he takes off his hat and his stethoscope falls out, and you just think, what a weird place to hide your stethoscope in your hat.
But the joke of it is he does that. The stethoscope comes out. He then hides the stethoscope back in his hat, turns to the monks and goes, "I'm a valet." It's like, what? He's like, "My master and mistress are going to Inverness." And then of course the monk guy is like, shush, and he's like, "Oh, you're Trappists," But yeah, it's a great exchange. I do really love that scene.
So funny.
And of course he does know.
I said it does show, this Watson leaning more into the, as I said, the Nigel Bruce's interpretation. It's a lot more silly in that way. He's serious when he needs to be, but a lot of the time he has these lovely little light moments.
Yeah, he does also notice they are reading the Book of Jonah. Mm-hmm. Which of course he was like, "Oh yeah, it's funny." He
nearly blurts out everything that they've been doing. It's like, "Oh Jesus Christ, shut up!"
Well, I think if it wasn't for them pretending that they're silent, he would have.
He probably would have.
Yeah, I think he only stops because even for him, it's socially awkward now.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Holmes. Sorry.
Yeah, then you get this lovely little sort of exchange with
Holmes and Gabrielle.
Yeah, and he's talking about the women that he's had in his life.
Well, because she's read the book. She's read Watson's stories, right, about him being misogynist, basically.
Yeah. And he says he just doesn't trust women, and he says about he had a fiance, and they were due to be married, and she got influenza, died, and then he says, "See, you just can't trust them. They're just unreliable."
Yeah, it's a nice exchange. But yeah, so anyway, in any case, they then I'm pretty sure is that everything on the train?
I think so.
I'm pretty sure it is. So they all get to Inverness, to the station. And immediately they're asking, "Oh, how do you get to the valley of the yew tree?" And he says, "Oh, it's about an hour out of town." The I guess it's like the baggage guy. Mm-hmm. And he says, "Well, you can get out there." He's like, "Well, it's no picnic." And he's like, Watson's like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, it's a cemetery."
Yeah.
And we kind of ominously pan up to see the monks walking across the bridge, which is a really, really nice shot.
It is. It's really cool.
So off they head, and we see the people dropping off the boxes, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got the big coffin and then two boxes. Holmes and Co are watching, And he's like, Watson's like, that's 3 boxes, Holmes. It's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure Sherlock Holmes can count. Of course, Gabrielle's like, oh my goodness, like the 2 small coffin, the 2 small ones must be children, because of course she's like, well, they're just coffins, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and we see that they are the vicar is reading the last rites, isn't he? As he's kind of putting them.
Well, he's reading the reading the funeral.
Or sorry, yes, the funeral.
The funeral, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then people start to immediately bury everything.
And he points out there were no mourners and there were no flowers.
Yeah, he says it because she says, "Oh, it's so sad," and he's like, "Yeah, sad and very odd."
Yeah.
And so they head over to the gravediggers, right? Yeah, he says, well, like, one of them's like moaning about his day, isn't he? He's like, oh, you sit around and nothing comes for weeks. Then all of a sudden, like a father and 2 sons die.
It feels more like he's happy to be working.
Well, yeah, he's complaining about the lack of death, I think, is effectively. And he's like, oh, at least now.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he basically says, well, the story is that their boat got swept in a storm or something.
Yeah, he says it was a father and 2 children, and they got. He said, but what? Well, he then says about
the official story is storm, right?
Yeah, and he says that but because he hints that they saw something, because he said that the
Watson's immediately like, the monster.
Yeah, and he says that basically the children had looks of fright that made them look like old men.
Yes, yeah. Watson, you immediately know he is totally down with any fucking conspiracy theory cryptid shit. He's all about it. He's like, oh my god, yes.
Yeah.
And he tries to explain it, and then he's like, the man's like, oh, what's the bloody use? Because he can kind of see the look on Sherlock's face, and he's like, oh, you know.
And he says to them, go on holiday in Loch Lomond or Loch somewhere else. He says, just don't go here because it's a terrible monster sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's Stanley Holloway, that gravedigger, who was a really big sort of like musical star and a really good actor. Actually, he had some really cool character performances.
You always find those amazing character actors in these kind of movies, especially like I think it was like especially prevalent 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. You especially those earlier years. Yeah. You just end up with those terrific character actors. Even if they're in like bit parts, they're just superb. Yeah. Because I always think of the drunk in Them. When we were reviewing Them, he's like so great, that guy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of the Hammer movies had that. When we've covered a few of the Hammer movies, we pointed out the guys in those ones that play drunks and everything. And there's the old the grave the mortician in Dracula and stuff who turns up in a few of those things. It's like the doddery old vicar in something else. I love those. Yeah, all those sort of characters are great. And I think you had those even in sort of Americas. You got right up until sort of the 80s. You got the guy who plays the hobo in Back to the Future. He played so many hobos.
It was like his job.
And one of the funniest things recently. So I've never actually watched it properly until recently. So I've been playing High on Life, which is a sort of game that's basically.
I know that game. Why do I know that game?
It's basically a sort of like a Rick and Morty.
I haven't played it. It's come up in my Steam store. That's why I recognise the name.
It's actually good fun. I'm enjoying it. It's like the guy who voices Morty and stuff. He does a lot of the voices.
Okay, it's been recommended a few times in my Steam kind of when it comes up with
Well, you can watch whole movies. They have whole movies in it. Right. And one of them is Tammy and the T-Rex.
Oh my god, that movie is fucking awful.
Yeah, I've never watched it all. I've only ever seen bits of it. But I actually sat and watched the whole thing on playing this game. And the hobo dude, it's one of the first times I've ever seen him in a. He plays a a sheriff
in a non-hobo role.
Yeah, he's completely shaved. I think he's one of the first times I've ever seen him without a beard.
Yeah,
and he's playing a sheriff. And it's like, oh, okay, that's quite funny. You know, terrible movie.
Oh yeah, it's real bad.
I still think.
I was listening to there was a podcast that Denise Richards was on, and she was talking about that film the other day. It was making me laugh.
I think Denise Richards is one of the most beautiful women ever.
She was, yeah, certainly.
Great actress, but I think
she's great in the right role. I mean, Wild Things, she's amazing in.
Oh, Wild Things is a really good movie.
Really good, yeah.
Yeah, she has one of the most perfect profiles of any woman.
Well, yeah, there is that too.
It's just her. I mean, she's beautiful, but her side profile is just. There's something about the way her nose sort of goes up, but that's a weird thing for me. But yeah. Anyway,
let's talk about midgets.
Let's talk about midgets. Yeah.
So it gets very sad for a brief moment. Children come. They must be the brothers of the boys that have died. But then, of course, Holmes is like, they're not brothers. Look at their faces. And he just, like, throws a rock at them or something.
Yeah, he says, give me some rocks.
Yeah. And of course, they all look around, and it's midgets. And, of course, this takes us back to the start of the movie on the previous thing. There are midgets involved. And when you find out what the midgets are for, this movie... But I think Watson's like, children with old men's faces. Like he's never seen a midget before in his life.
Like, Watson, really?
I mean, like Holmes has to remind him. He's like, remember the story?
Yeah, it's like even if you don't, you do sort of think, even if you don't,
you've definitely seen a midget before.
Probably know what a midget looks like.
The fucking 1800s. You've definitely been to a circus once or twice, dude.
Yeah.
But anyway, the boys don't actually see them, even though Holmes threw a rock at them. So you know, they say that Holmes says as they leave, he's like, well, the question is now, if they weren't boys, then who is in the third grave, the big box? So he jumps down. And you know, they redig the hole.
I think they come back at night, don't they? I think.
Well, it's certainly night by the time he's opening the casket.
I don't imagine they straight away opened it.
No, probably not. It's just cut weird to where it looks like
it is kind of cut that way, but I think it's supposed to have been some time when they've gone away and come back.
But Gabrielle screams and faints. Holmes doesn't give a fuck. He's like, give me that lantern. Yeah. It's like, I don't care if she's fainted.
Yeah. Watson immediately is the medical man, and he's attending her, and he's like,
yeah.
His face when Holmes, you know, says, give me the lamp, he just looks at him, you know, incredulously.
Yeah, he just doesn't understand. And he says, it's Valadon, isn't it? And he said, well, obviously. But what he's most interested in is the ring.
Yeah. There's also, was it 4 canaries in with him as well?
Yes, so there's 4 canaries that are completely white, and the ring is discolored green.
Yeah.
Which will be useful later. Useful information for about half an hour's time.
Yeah.
So yes, more clues have been had. They head to, I guess it's like a nearby hotel near the lock, right? Overlooking the lock. And they say, oh yeah, you know, you've got a lovely view of the lock here, and you know, here's points of interest if you want to do any sightseeing and whatnot. And of course, they are a couple. So they have one room, and then, of course, Holmes is taken off to his room, which he's delighted initially to hear is in the attic, not in the basement.
Yeah, so is it about this is actually earlier. This is before, isn't it? Because when they first arrive there, they get that, and then they go back to the rooms when what?
Well, no, this is where he gets told, because he says, the privy's in the basement.
Oh, I thought that was earlier, but yeah. I like it when he says, yeah. He says, your room's upstairs, because the privy's in the basement.
But yeah,
you get what Holmes looking at the ring and being very,
he's such an asshole in this scene because she starts crying. She's like weeping in the corner, and he's like, "I wish you wouldn't do that."
Yeah. Basically, shut up. You're bothering my train of thought.
But then he does say to her, he's like, "Look, if we're gonna get to the bottom of this, then I need to focus." And and he's very interested in the color of the ring.
Yeah.
And he says like the copper ring turning green leads me to suspect that he wasn't drowned.
Yeah.
Because that just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And he says like, if we're going to continue and find out what really happened to your husband, then we can't act like you can't act like a grief-stricken widow, even though you are.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And he says, we're in disguise.
Yeah, we're an English couple, even though you're clearly Belgian.
I don't think she says anything in front of people, though, does she?
No, she does. No.
So I guess they get away with it from that perspective.
Yeah.
But of course, Watson bursts in. He's like, "Oh my god, the Loch Ness Monster!" This is where this movie starts going right off the fucking rails.
Yeah.
And I love it. But this movie is so cracktastic. It's like the things that happen towards the end of this movie. I'm like, this is amazing, but
it's ludicrous, but kind of believable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it works.
Yeah.
It does work, but it is fucking. They're like, no, midget submarine means small people. You're like, don't think that's what midget submarines are, but okay, sure. But yeah, so Watson's like, I can see it, and for once, we do see that he does see it. He looks through the spyglass, and he does actually see the Loch Ness Monster. But
you see the classic Nettie head.
Yeah.
Going in the water. But
of course, it's gone by the time Holmes looks and sees nothing. And he's like, "Yeah, no, look, Holmes, I swear to you, I saw it. It's clear as anything, But Holmes is like, oh, dude, we're living in the 19th century now, dude. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And he says, well, in any case, it couldn't have been the Loch Ness Monster because this man didn't drown. He died of asphyxiation. And he says, I can only think of one thing that would cause the canaries to lose their color and for the ring to become green and discolored, which is chlorine gas. And Watson's like, that doesn't matter. I literally just saw the Loch Ness Monster. Like, regardless of this case, I have just seen the Loch Ness Monster. But of course, Holmes is not going to have any of that. And I think this is like the moment where Watson actually snaps a little bit.
Yeah.
He's like, you talk about being logical. You're the least logical man I know, and he starts really losing it. It's like the fact that he's been called out over this Loch Ness Monster thing is like the final straw for him.
Yeah.
And he says, "How could I have imagined it when all you've done most of my fucking life with you is tell me that I have no imagination?"
Yeah. It was brilliant.
Yeah. So anyway, they head off on a very picturesque bike ride. As a couple.
He says, now we've got to figure out what castle it is, and I like the way he pulls out that map of the lake, and it's got you just got this like massive ring of castles all the way around the lake. Yeah,
because he was given the pamphlet, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
The sightseeing pamphlet. And yeah,
this is another one of my favourite little things of this movie. Is so they go out on him and the missus, as it were, are on the tandem, and you've got Watson on
the valet behind,
and they're travelling around. And what I love is you've got that beautiful music score as they're sort of riding along, and every time they get to a castle, bagpipes start.
Yep.
And then when they're away from the castle, the soundtrack comes back in again, and then it goes back into the bagpipes when they're at the next castle. I fucking love that. It's so brilliant.
I saw a guy. No, actually, no, it was a woman that did it. There was this video I saw years ago on Instagram, and it was amazing. And it was like basically anytime Hollywood visits an Arabic city.
Yes.
And she just went through all the music and broke down every fucking like stereotypical audio cue, and I was like, oh my god, that's so spot on every goddamn time.
Yep.
But yeah, so they visit many castles. They have a spot of lunch, and they just they're basically still looking. But then Watson remembers while they're having lunch about the monks, and he said, "Oh, they were reading the Book of Jonah." And because they see them, don't they? I think they see them walking.
Yeah, they're at the distance. Yeah. At the lake.
And this is again. I think this is the first time that Gabriella does her sign, her Morse code in front of Holmes.
Yeah.
And of course, Holmes immediately spots it. You can see he spots it immediately.
Yeah, and she makes up a lame excuse about the bee. She says,
yeah,
"Oh, there's a bee."
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
sure.
So eventually they come across a.
I'd say at this point when they're having their sort of lunch and that, you do get the sort of slight feeling that sometimes the way he looks at her, you do get the beginnings of a slight more feeling of attachment to her.
Yes,
I think just a slight hint of it.
Yeah, no, I go with that. I think there is something in the performance where it's like, yeah, maybe he's bisexual, maybe, you know.
Yeah.
But they eventually come across a castle which is under repair. We see the wooden scaffold and whatnot against these ruins. Either it's under repair or it's just so ruined that they're using scaffold to keep it up. And it has a big sign saying "Don't come in." So of course they immediately go in.
Yeah, it's fenced off, and they've got dogs patrolling the grounds. And as she points out, if they want, that why make it so obvious that they want people to keep out?
Yeah. But they head down, and a guard immediately comes out and says, this place is off limits. It's from the Preservation Society of Scottish Monuments or something. And Holmes is like, oh, that's such a shame because, my wife here particularly wanted to see this castle. It's one of the most interesting examples of medieval architecture, and starts talking about the year it was built and stuff.
Yeah, is it 14th century? He says, was it James the second or third or something he says, or that?
Yeah, and then the guard's like, the third, and if you'd like to come back next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's having none of it basically. But it was a good show. It was a good a good attempt by Holmes to kind of talk him round,
But he does get clues from him.
Yeah.
He's obviously not a fucking guide because he was a century out and a James out.
Yes, yeah. Of course, Watson is completely oblivious to this. He's like, "Oh, he was a pleasant bloke,"
Yeah.
It's like, of course, as it should be. It's down to Holmes to explain it. But then, of course, they hear the chirping of birds. And Watson's like, "Oh, it's just birds," and Sherlock's like, "No, those birds are chirping too much."
Yeah, that's what he says. Do you hear something? And he says, "No, I can't hear anything over the birds."
And of course we see some workers taking out some sulfuric acid and some birds.
It's the two blokes from the drop, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So you get them taking out the birds and jars of sulfuric acid,
which Holmes figures when exposed to salt water creates chlorine gas, which is presumably how man died.
Yeah.
So he he then gets Watson. I love when he's like, "Watson, clasp your hands together." No, not like that. Like this. It's like basically you could just say, "Give me a help up
give
here."
Me a bunk up.
But he's like, "No, he's too stupid to get that. I need to give him precise instructions."
Yeah. Well, I think it's worse than that. I think it almost feels like he's just. It's almost like he just can't say give me a bunk up. He has to be elaborate, and he has to has to go through the whole thing.
I think you're right.
Almost humiliating Watson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So he climbs up and he sees them taking stuff into the tower. And he kind of says to himself, well, maybe this tower is more interesting than I actually originally thought. But then we see another man come out with the two dogs. And it is pretty clear that they probably need to leave.
Yeah.
Which they promptly do. So that evening, they head out on the lake. And of course, Watson's like, we should not be on this lake. Because, of course, Watson saw the monster.
Yeah. Watson's like, we've been like at the front, we've been the back, and now we're on the bloody lake, sort of thing.
Yeah, and he says, we shouldn't be out here. You'll catch the death of cold. And he says, I like Watson says, like, well, wouldn't that be funny if Sherlock's last case was a case of pneumonia?
Yeah.
I thought that was quite a good line. But yes, so Watson sees the monster again in the distance.
Yeah. This time they all see it.
Yes, and Sherlock's like, go after it. We're going after it.
Yeah, and I like what I like is like Sherlock says, right, we're going after it, and Watson's like, being the man of action he is, he immediately goes full into sort of action mode, starts rowing, and then he realizes that he's like, why
wait
are
a
we
minute.
going
Yeah.
Should we go away from it?
Eventually they lose it in the fog, and Holmes is like, "Oh, have you still got your stethoscope?" And Watson's like, "I never leave home without it." It's like it's in his hat always. Of course, Holmes uses it, puts it in the water, and can clearly hear the sound of engines. He doesn't say that though; he just says he hears something. And it's just getting closer and closer. And eventually, the goddamn Loch Ness monster turns up. It comes up from the depths and out into the fog. And I love Watson's like, I'm gonna fight it with oars.
I'm gonna throw our only means of getting ashore.
Yeah.
At the monster.
I guess that's a problem for 10 minutes time if you survive the Loch Ness monster attack.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they fall into the water. Gabrielle loses her parasol, which she seems very worried about. And then Holmes actually is very worried for Watson because he finds Watson's hat and he's like, "Oh my God, Watson!" But of course, Watson's already made himself back onto the boat. Yep. And yes, so they make it back safely onto the boat. And he says, "Well, I've come face to face with man-eating tigers and stampeding elephants, but I wasn't as frightened as I am by this beast." And of course, Holmes has got it figured. And he points into the distance, and of course, in the distance is the castle they were heading to in the first place. And it looked like the Loch Ness monster was heading that way. And I think Watson says like, "Oh, it's going for its supper."
Yeah. You see the actual scaffold starts rising.
Yes.
Like a sort of gate.
Yeah. But they head home to dry off, and Watson's like so annoyed that he has to wear a kilt.
I love it. He's
like, "You can't borrow a decent pair of trousers around here."
She laughs at him, and
yeah.
He's like, "You can find a decent pair of trousers anywhere."
But yeah, so I think it doesn't. Sherlock starts whistling, and Watson's like, "Oh, tell us then, because you only start whistling when you're at the end, when you've come to some, some realization."
We forgot actually his whistle when after they've spoken to Mycroft, and he tells them to go drop the case and that.
Yeah.
And they're walking home, and all the way on the journey to the front door, Holmes is whistling "I'll Take the High Road."
Oh yes,
and
yeah.
and that it's again, it's that Watson just doesn't get the hint at all.
No,
until it's sort of too late, sort of thing. You know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, here he is not whistling "I'll Take the High Road." He is whistling "Swan Lake."
Swan Lake, yeah.
And he says, "Oh, remember Swan Lake? It was a swan, but it wasn't really a swan. And in this case, there's a monster, but it's not really a monster." He said, "It's a monster that feeds on canaries and sulfuric acid." Yeah, so he's starting to figure out, what could it possibly be? And he said, well, he basically says it had the heart of an engine. He heard an engine in the water, right?
Yep.
And he says that water is an excellent sound conductor, and there's no doubt it's a mechanical monster. It's not a flesh and blood monster. And the bubbles on the surface suggest that it was also got mechanical lungs. And Gabriella says, well, do you think that my husband was involved in this? And Holmes says, yes, I do. I think I'm certain of it. He says, well, Watson says, why would someone build such a thing? And why was he anonymously buried? And Holmes says, well, clearly whatever this thing is and whatever they're doing, it's being kept top secret. And of course he believes it's almost certainly going to be the club that's keeping it secret. And at that moment there's a knock at the door. And there's a bottle of champagne for Mr. and Mrs. Ashdown. Or actually, I think specifically for Mr. Ashdown. And he I think it's like the manager of the hotel. He was like, I was given specific instructions to deliver this to you, and also there's a carriage waiting for you downstairs. I like Holmes is like, are you sure you got the right Mr. Ashdown? Like as if there's more. And yeah, so off.
But he does say actually it's for the carriage is for Sherlock Holmes, doesn't he say?
Oh yes, I think he does. Yeah, yeah. And then so he goes downstairs, and of course there is a carriage waiting for him, and off they go.
Because he's supposed to deliver the champagne to the place, isn't he?
Yes. So out he hops from the cab, and he starts walking up the steps, and it's like a red carpet out now, and
the red carpet's being put out, and then there's a tent.
Yeah.
And Mycroft comes out.
Yeah.
And I like he says this champagne's not even a good year.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be drunk.
He says, it's not for drinking. So he takes him into the tent, and he says, Holmes complains about what happened the night before. And he says, well, it serves you right. You shouldn't have been out on the lake at all. I told you not to get involved in this whatsoever.
And like you've got like the plans, the submarine all over the place, and there's stuff everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess at this point, this is meant to be a public display, or not a public display, but a display for the Queen and whatnot. And it's going to be, it makes sense that it would all be here laid out in the tent for them to peruse and look through and whatnot. Mycroft, of course, has the parasol, the Gabrielle's parasol, so Holmes looks at it, and of course he says, well, he thinks it's powered by sulfuric acid, and the canaries were to ensure that the oxygen levels were okay, much like with miners. And yeah, so he's like, well, you know, and Mycroft is somewhat impressed. I think. Not that he shows it particularly well.
No.
But he says, Holmes says, well, it's a unique contraption. And Mycroft says, well, not quite unique, unfortunately. There's like 4 or 5 other countries that are also trying to develop what we would call a submersible. And he says, well, none of them have been able to solve the problem of how to stay submerged for long enough. And of course, now Holmes understands the Jonah references, because Jonah lived in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. So it's all starting to make some sense. And yeah, so basically Mycroft admits that the reason he died was because he was one of the original people in one of the earlier tests, and it went wrong.
Yeah.
And they died of asphyxiation, just as Holmes said they would. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, then why did you go to all of this effort to hide things from Madame Baladon, Gabrielle? And he says, well, your client is not Madame Valadon. He's like, that's not who she is at all.
Yeah, she deals on Hoffman style.
Yes, and she's like German intelligence, right?
Yeah, she works for I forget the actual wording, but it's German intelligence.
And of course, they didn't know, they couldn't figure out the secret, so they enlisted the world's greatest detective to find out.
And he says, Miss Hoffenstahl, Miss Valadon is dead. They finished her off.
He shows her a picture of her, doesn't he? The actual.
Yeah, he gets a picture out and shows it to her, presuming it would have been Gabrielle's from his desk, I guess, from that, where he was working there.
Yeah. And yeah, he says she's one of their most skillful agents.
Yeah.
She's basically been playing you this whole time.
And he's really angry at him for being, because he basically says, the smartest brain in England couldn't fucking work out, that this was a German spy. He'd been totally played here.
Yeah. But then the Queen arrives, and we see what the red carpet was for. It is a royal visit to basically see this submarine, which looks like the Loch Ness Monster.
Chris and the submarine, and
the bit I love the fucking most about this whole ludicrous situation of midgets powering a submarine or piloting a submarine, because the submarine needed to be small, so it's a midget submarine, literally a midget submarine, not a small submarine, but literally a midget submarine, a submarine for midgets. Midget submarines are a real thing. They don't have midgets in them generally, though.
Usually no.
So this is a literal midget submarine.
I mean, it kind of makes sense to have smaller people in a very
in your test vessel, I guess.
I mean, submarines even now, they're not, they're constructed quite as small as they possibly can be within size, because
absolutely.
For pressure reasons.
But what you generally do with a midget submarine is you just have a couple of people in it.
Yes.
Not 6 midgets.
Yeah.
But what I love is this whole fucking thing is going on. This whole ridiculous situation where you have this submarine powered by midgets, and it also is disguised as the Loch Ness Monster to hide the fact that it presumably, while they're testing it, they're hiding the fact that it's a submarine. Scare off the locals. But what I love about it is the Queen comes in, and she's all delighted, and Mycroft is full of himself as he shows her around this thing.
He's so fucking happy, isn't he? He's so smug and joyful in he's got the Queen here to see his little project.
Yeah, and of course he can brag in front of Holmes as well.
Yeah, and what I love
Sherlock,
is he introduces it to Sherlock, and she's immediately going, "Oh, Sherlock, because we have read all your stories, and does this mean I get to read about this adventure soon?" And he's like, hopefully not. This hasn't been one of my good ones, sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, what I find most ridiculous is this midget tiny submarine.
Yeah.
The Queen doesn't realize that this is a military vessel.
No.
Even though...
She thinks it's a pleasure cruise because when she's being shown around, when Mycroft is showing off all the technology, you know, this is the battery, this is this, and this is that, and she says, "Where's the glass bottom?" And Mycroft is completely baffled.
Well, like, yeah.
What's a glass bottom? And Sherlock immediately goes, "Well, to see all the fish and the bottom of the sea." And Mycroft is completely like, "What? This isn't a pleasure vehicle. This is a warship."
But what I don't understand is that the Queen walked up to this sub and looked at it.
Yeah,
and saw that half the fucking submarine is a torpedo. Like, the torpedo is almost as big as the fucking sub. She just hadn't noticed, I guess.
It's just an embellishment.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, in fairness to her, the brass or gold trim definitely does make it look a bit more pleasure cruisy than, you know, than military.
Yeah, it's very over the top steampunky.
And of course, I like, she even points out, she's like, "What is the purpose of that gargoyle?" The monster on the top.
The head.
And she says, "Oh, to frighten away sharks, I imagine." It's like, yes. In the lock, all of those sharks.
I also I love you get the midgets on the top like lining up because they're all in like proper sailor outfits. Like they're not actual navy. They're like acrobats, aren't they? But
I also love as well that when she's introduced, she notices the midgets, and he says, "Oh, he's piloted by midgets." She says, "Oh, we should do that for all the navy. It gets really exhausting having to stand on when pinning medals on people." It's like, yeah, this is much better. I can sit down and do it if they're all midgets.
Yeah, and they remove the he's like, "It's only a decoy. We can remove." They remove the head.
Yeah. But yeah, so
the original. Do you know about the original thing? Because they were hoping to film on the lock, so they had the original.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They built this a flotation sort of thing,
right?
And it had like humps. It had humps to make it float and things like that. But then it went wrong and it sank.
Oh God!
And they decided they weren't going to use it anyway.
Is it still there?
I don't know if it's still there, but it was. They a survey vessel found it in, I think it was 2013.
Oh right.
So it was still there then. So yeah, and apparently Wilder wasn't terribly bothered, but apparently the person who made it was like he said he was more sorry for the guy who made it than for himself.
I was gonna say I would imagine the locals weren't fucking too happy about it, but. But yeah, so of course the Queen is aghast as she discovers it's a military vessel, and promptly gives much to Holmes' amusement, gives Mycroft an absolute dressing down.
Yeah, well, she says, "You mean you fire on the person without them knowing you're there?"
Yeah, she's like, "This is so un-British of us to be doing this."
Terrible. And from what I remember about real submarines, there was during the Napoleonic War, the submarines were sort of mooted, and I think the same thing was cited then. It's like, no, it's unsportsmanlike. It's not very, to use a submarine in that style. I mean, it obviously it fucking went on to be used in that way, but I think initially it was seen as just unfair.
Mycroft counters saying, "Oh, well, right now the Germans are making a Zeppelin. It's gonna fucking bomb your palace." Basically, it's like, they're specifically gonna come over just to bomb the Queen.
And he says one of our spies made drawings of it, but he was captured at the border.
Yeah.
Which will come in later.
And she says, "Don't worry about it. I'll deal with the Germans. I'll write them a strongly worded letter."
Yeah, it's her grandson.
Yeah, she's like, "They would never do this."
yeah, I shall write to him. Is it Little Willie or whatever she calls him?
Yeah.
And what I love is you can see how amused Sherlock is.
He says, "Oh, we've both been undone by a woman."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, it's a shame. It's such superb engineering, all for nothing." Of course, Mycroft is already thinking how he can make this work. And he's like, "Oh, not necessarily. If the Germans want it, maybe we should give it to them."
Yep.
And of course, it's then given to Holmes to deal with. He's going to ensure that the Germans steal the boat, and the boat will be sabotaged, and they'll all drown at sea or in the loch, not at sea.
Yeah, he says because there's a German warship off the coast of Scotland, sort of in waiting.
Yeah. So of course Holmes heads back with the parasol.
Mm-hmm.
He heads back. Gabrielle's in bed. And he smashes the chandelier, or I know it might be the side of the bed actually.
He hits the I think it's the chandelier. I think it is.
Yeah, it's a chandelier. Yeah,
metal chandelier that I think he.
And he's like, "Oh, while you're up."
Yeah.
And he basically says, "Hey, your German friends are waiting out there," and we see all the monks are lined up, and he basically says, "Look, I know who you are," and she says, "Oh, you've been on to me from the start, haven't you?" And he said, "Well, not quite from the start, but yeah." And he says,
"I think it's never you never quite know which details he figured out and which he didn't, but he certainly didn't know she was a German spy. He knew there was something up."
I think he knew for sure that the moment she started doing the Morse code with the umbrella in front of him at lunch.
Well, he certainly, obviously, but I don't know whether he knew that she was a German spy yet or not. That's the thing. It's
yeah. I guess she didn't get much Morse code out then, did she? To make much of a, But in any case, he figured out enough. And so he says, "Hey, we found your signaling device. It's a bit damp, but there it is." And he says, "Well, would you mind telling them where to find the submersible?" And he's like, "Okay, well then fine, I'll have to do it myself." And so he does. He hangs the parasol out the window, and he starts doing Morse code. She kind of watches almost helplessly. She kind of joins in, but she knows the gig's up. And of course the monks see it and all head off to their doom, effectively. And yeah, that's that. She then basically is like, "Well, what are you going to do about me then? What's the deal?" And he says, "Well, you better prepare yourself," effectively. He does tell her what's going to happen, doesn't he? Because he says, "Oh, they're expert sailors, I'm sure, but effectively they're gonna be asphyxiated as soon as they kind of leave."
Yeah, it's going to be sabotage, and they're just going to be it. They're just going to sink, and that's going to be it. They're going to be dead.
Yeah.
They do. You get they look out and you see the bubbles of the sinking sub.
Yes.
The champagne and a Bible floating in the water, which again doesn't really make sense because I don't think bottles of full champagne float, but fine.
Of course, we get that nice kind of a sweet moment where she says, "I'm sorry I didn't give you a closer game," and he says, "Oh, close enough," and that's where he says, "Oh, Watson never writes about my failures."
Yeah.
Just as Watson comes in and falls over her luggage, and he's like, Holmes, I saw the monster again. I saw it again." And of course we then see the sinking.
Yep.
And yeah, that's the end of it. And of course he looks out and he says, "Oh, what's go see what's left of it." And he sees the Bible and the champagne.
Yeah.
And
I like the moments between Stevens and Genevieve Page, I think her name. The moment that there is a genuine sort of feeling between them. I think you get they definitely felt like it was almost more than a game between them.
Yeah.
And as she says that, you know, she was originally going to go to Japan for a mission, but when she found out that it was going to be against Sherlock Holmes was going to be involved, she changed. She specifically volunteered for this mission.
Yeah.
And she wanted to go up against the best.
Yeah. So Mycroft turns up, and she says, "Well, I'm ready. I've heard terrible things about your prison's heating. They're too cold.
Yeah, cold and damp."
But Mycroft says, "Well, you're not going. You're going back to Germany. Basically a prisoner exchange."
Which I think she's being exchanged for the guy that Mycroft mentioned.
Yeah, the intelligence guy
spying on the Zeppelin.
But Mycroft does make it clear that it was Holmes's idea.
Yes.
Which obviously then she's quite pleased about. She realizes that he does actually care for her somewhat. You know, it's not all hate on his part, and obviously, he is gonna stop her from going to prison. And that's the kind of case resolved at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And off they go. But of course, it kind of ends on a somber note.
Yeah, you get them going as she's leaving.
She does the Morse code, doesn't she?
She signals to him, "I'll be the same."
And that would have been a happier ending.
Yes.
The one we actually get, because it then kind of cuts to them being back home at Baker Street.
Later.
I think it must be like winter time because it's snowing, right? It's like
I think it's
Christmas or something.
It's got the snow on the street, so it's clearly some months have passed.
And they're sitting down for dinner, and for breakfast. Sorry, and Holmes has got a letter from Mycroft, effectively, and
again he does that elaborate opening with the
knife. Yeah,
swish.
And of course he opens it and is kind of visibly upset, visibly moved.
He's very, very upset, and he gets up and he moves away from the table.
Yeah. And of course Watson's like, "Are you not going to finish your breakfast?" And then of course he reads the letter himself, and
the way that Watson picks it up with the sugar tongs and reads it with the sugar tongs.
Yes, he even turns it with the sugar tongs as well.
Yeah.
And of course he reads that she was captured and executed in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But Mycroft does actually say it might interest you to know that she was going under the name of Mrs. Ashcroft for the past few months.
Yeah.
So clearly, there was something between them, or at least from her to him.
Yeah.
It's quite a somber note to end on, I thought, for what is otherwise quite a comedic, funny film.
And then
for the most part,
he says to Watson, "Where's the bag?" And Watson says it's hidden in, was it July to October or something? He says, and it's hidden amongst the files.
Yeah.
And he takes it down, and I love the way he takes it down, and he looks at the bag and he opens it, and he looks at Watson. He says, "You're getting better at hiding it," sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's such a beautifully melancholy expression on his face, the way he says it to him. So it's like a little smile touches his face, and he goes off to his room with the needle and the cocaine, and that's how it ends.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a somber ending, I thought. Because the rest of the movie doesn't take itself terribly seriously.
There are moments.
There's certainly moments, but it is much more light-hearted than something.
Being presumptuous and things like that. There's some really nice little sort of jolts of.
But certainly compared to something like Hound of the Baskervilles, it's much more light-hearted here. But yeah, a very somber ending, I thought. But I liked it. It was good.
It's great, and sadly it didn't do terribly well at the cinema, and it tanked, and
it has something of a following, though, doesn't it?
It does not. Yeah, it went on to be seen as kind of ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
and Billy Wilder, I think, was so upset by its failure because he thought it was his best looking movie.
I think some of the shots are really good.
Beautiful movie.
Yeah.
It's beautifully shot. And I don't think he would ever talk about it. I think when people asked about him, he refused to talk about it because I think he was so sort of annoyed with its failure. Because he'd been trying to work on get a Sherlock Holmes movie done since the 60s.
Right.
Sorry, the late 50s, I think. And he wanted at one stage he was going to be doing a musical version, which I'm kind of glad they didn't do. But I know there have been musical versions, and there was one that was out, but that sort of fell through, and he finally got this, and I think it was his biggest budgeted movie as well. Right. So it was just added to the failure. Yeah. Which I think is a great shame because I'm glad that it's seen better now. I mean, I think Kim Newman, the reviewer, one of my favourite reviewers and authors, I think he says it's the best Sherlock Holmes movie ever made.
I really like it.
I do love it.
I think it's up there. As I said, I think Hound of the Baskervilles is my favourite. The Cushing version. Yeah. But this is great. I really enjoyed rewatching it. It's not one I rewatch regularly, so.
It's one I go. It is one I go back to.
I knew it was one of your favourites because I know you've suggested this one before for sure.
It's one of those few times where I really appreciate a different sort of Holmes and Watson.
Yeah, it's very different, and I think that is what I've come to appreciate with it as well. Rewatching it, it was actually really refreshing. But yeah, great fun. That was The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Highly, highly recommended. Well worth your time. We've talked about it longer than the film, so that's always a good sign.
Yeah.
In any case, we will be back next week. Matt's finally seen Nosferatu, and I'm sure I'll find some things to watch, and we'll have a good old discussion. But until then, stay safe, take care, and we will catch you next time.